here we have a post on X courtesy of that EU Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen. She says this: following a good call with the President of the United States, we have agreed to meet in Scotland on Sunday to discuss transatlantic trade relations and how we can keep them strong. That meeting happening around, I do believe, 11 a.m., 11:45 a.m. Eastern time. We will bring it to you live, raw, and unfiltered as soon as it gets underway. Continuing on now, though, bringing it back here to the States as we follow the latest regarding several news out of Congress. A look here at the Capitol building over in Washington, D.C. Now, it's recess time in Congress, and House members are heading home early while senators still have another week to go. President Trump, however, putting pressure on them before they leave. Now, both groups have plenty of unfinished business waiting for them. To discuss everything that happened during these last sessions, I do want to bring into the conversation now political analyst and historian Rich Rubino. Rich, good to see you.
Good to see you as well.
All right, so let's get a full recap of this last session. Let's start with the House of Representatives. What was accomplished?
I think when you go back in history and you look at this session, it's going to be the quote, One Big Beautiful Bill Act. That's the one thing people are going to remember that's been achieved so far. Obviously, from a public relations standpoint, the Democrats seem to be winning. If you look at the polls, the majority of the American people are against it, which means that Republicans, and when they go back, and certainly during recess, they have to go back to their constituents. They have to sell the bill, and they have to sell the positives of the legislation. So it's really a public relations war, if you will. But there have been many minor pieces of legislation that have passed. But this is basically the flagship issue. And this is really going to be something really going to affect, I think, the midterm elections, as Democrats are going to say that it cuts Medicaid, that it cuts food stamps, and it's going to raise the deficit and consequently the debt. Contrary-wise, Republicans are going to say that it extends the tax cuts from 2017, it provides provisions for no tax on tips, for example, extends the child tax credit. So it's really going to be a public relations tussle between both sides.
So last week, Speaker of the House Mike Johnson actually left. They let them out early there for that summer recess, but they came back about a day later to vote on a couple of other initiatives or talk about some other things that have been left unfinished during the session. Can you explain what all that was about?
Yes, and this is certainly what basically, usually, for example, in August, the Congress is in recess, and during that recess period, the congressmen are either in their districts holding town halls or doing district type work. Oftentimes, they often spend a lot of time campaigning for colleagues. Some of them going on vacation. But I think that he basically he called the Congress back into session just for one day to do some kind of last minute business. But he also called recess after that. And I think there are many Democrats that are saying then this is something that really benefits them from a public relations standpoint. They're saying that Congress needs to get back to work to do the American people's work, that type of a thing. But he did call recess, and also Mr. Trump has said that he wants the Senate not to be in recess in August so that they can confirm his nominations. Basically, the United States Senate has basically plenary authority over the nominations that President Trump puts up to positions, anything from cabinet members to sub-cabinet members, and the House of Representatives really has no input on that.
Now, before we talk a little bit more about the Senate and what they still have left to do, what are the main priorities for the House when they do come back from that recess?
I think that certainly it's going to be more spending pieces of legislation that they're going to be dealing with. The big, beautiful bill has already passed. Donald Trump has basically signed it. Another thing is that he also is doing many trade deals with other countries, whether it was for Vietnam, for example, the UK, but he kind of has authority over that, and it doesn't really necessarily go to Congress. It'll be very interesting to see what's going to be on the Congress's calendar. There's going to be a lot of legislation. I think it's going to be minor legislation, naming post offices, for example, that you don't really hear, that doesn't really have much parlance in the American people, but I think that there will be a lot of minor pieces of legislation. And in the United States Senate, it's really going to be a lot of confirmation hearings among people that are for sub-cabinet positions, for example. But Trump wants as many of his cabinet and sub-cabinet positions, rather, to win confirmation in the United States Senate. That's why he wants them to stay in session.
So let's talk a little bit about some of these nominations? Because as you have mentioned, and we have mentioned here, the Senate's still having a week left to go. President Trump putting a lot of pressure on those senators. What are some of the biggest conflicts when it comes to these certain nominations, and why has it been so hard to get them confirmed?
You always have this, and a lot of this is basically when a president comes in, there are 14 cabinet members, and those cabinet members usually are voted on very quickly. Almost always they're voted, and the United States Senate votes in favor of them, even if they're from a different party. But then you have sub-cabinet positions, and you have ambassadorships. And if you think of it, there's an ambassador basically to just about every country. Sometimes they might be, for example, to two or three countries, like maybe New Zealand and Samoa, something to that effect. But there are a lot of ambassadorial nominations. Sometimes what happens is a senator will put a hold, meaning that essentially they will say that I want to deal with another issue before, or I want to talk about another issue before we can get this person confirmed or not confirmed. But these are usually non-controversial. They're usually people you've never heard of. Oftentimes, they're people who have given money to their parties, and in return, there's a quid pro quo there. They get appointed or nominated to an ambassadorship, pretty much of their choice. But it's either usually a lot less controversial than, say, the big beautiful bill is.
We started the conversation with talking about some of what was accomplished within the House, but what will the Senate session be most remembered for?
The exact same thing. When you go, for example, certainly when you go to the 2026 midterm elections, this is going to be the issue. Hakeem Jeffries, for example, the House Minority Leader from New York, assuming he doesn't have a major primary challenge, would make him spend a lot of time in his district. He's going to be spending an inordinate amount of time in other congressmen's districts campaigning for Democrats, and he's going to be saying that the so-called big beautiful bill, he's going to be calling it something like the big ugly bill, and he's going to be campaigning. And it's basically this is going to be the major issue in the 2026 in 2026. Basically, no Republican. In the House of Representatives, only Tom Massey of Kentucky on the right, and then Brian Fitzpatrick on the left voted against it. It's very similar to the Inflation Reduction Act back in 2021, which was passed with only Democratic votes. So basically, this Congress is so bifurcated right now that I think that when congressmen go back to the go back to the district, you have a scenario where Republicans are going to have to defend it and say why this is a good piece of legislation. And I think Democrats are going to have to say that this is a bad piece of legislation. And they're probably going to make up some sort of a proposal we can do better so that they have some sort of a positive proposal for 2026. But it's really going to be a battle royale in the midterm elections. And I don't see any other piece of legislation or any other issue becoming paramount over this.
So we are talking about the first 6 months of President Trump's presidency, his second time here in the Oval Office. When it comes to you and your thoughts on how everything has kind of played out over the last several months, Rich, is there anything that has stood out to you that may be a bit different or a bit unusual from previous sessions of Congress when we talk about this one that just passed?
Yes, and that's the piece. Certainly, the piece of legislation, the so-called "big beautiful bill," certainly stands out. Whether you're for it or against it, it is a major transmogrification, if you will, of the legislative priorities of the United States Congress. But I also think the trade deals are very interesting because he has basically plenary authority to negotiate some of these trade deals by himself. So it's almost like an executive agreement, if you will. It's basically 242 of the Trade Adjustment Act, which allows him to do that, meaning that he does not necessarily have to get Congress's approval on a lot of this piece, on a lot of these deals. Are sometimes almost gentlemen's agreement between America and other countries. But he's really trying to reorder the entire trade system of the United States by proposing that tariffs will be placed on a litany of countries, and then having the other countries having to come back to the United States to try to negotiate something. And I think that's very interesting. And I think it's very interesting that Republicans, including the moderate Republicans, congressmen like Mike Lawler of New York, who's up for reelection, for example, voted for this piece of legislation. It's very unpopular in his congressional district, so it's really gonna have to see how he does in terms from a public relations standpoint, how he sells this to his constituents in New York State, and there are other certainly moderate Republicans as well in the United States Senate. Interestingly, Susan Collins from Maine, who's up for re-election in 2026, is the only Republican United States senator who represents a state that last time went for Vice President Harris in 2024, who is up for reelection as a Republican, but she voted against it. So I think she'll basically try to make the case that she's independent minded and that she is not necessarily a monolith or in lockstep with President Trump.
Now, Rich, before I let you go, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you or get a little bit of a comment from this entire situation happening with the Epstein files. Now, I'm going to pose it more of a political historical question. Putting up here a post from Representative Thomas Massey. He says this: the Speaker of the House recessed Congress early yesterday for a month to avoid dealing with the Epstein issue. Mr. Speaker, the American people won't forget. My legislation isn't going away. It'll be right here when we return, and I'll force the vote using a discharge petition. So I want you to explain to us a little bit what a discharge petition is, but also when we look back at history and some controversies that we have seen involving the President of the United States, what can we expect from this investigation regarding Epstein going forward?
Well, discharge position, basically the Speaker of the House has authority over what legislation is going to be considered in the House of Representatives. So he can basically take a piece of legislation that's kind of in the hopper and say, we're going to vote on this, we're going to vote on that. But if you get a majority of the United States House of Representatives, if you get an outright majority out of the United States House of Representatives to vote for a discharge position, that means that the Speaker of the House has to immediately essentially has to immediately put this on the floor, and the House has to debate it. The House has to vote it. You saw this many times in the early 2000s. For example, the blue dog or moderate conservative Democrats wanted campaign finance reforms. They kept on trying to get a discharge position to get that to the House of Representatives. It's very rare that this happens. Obviously, Congressman Massey is very much more of a libertarian than a Republican. Speaker Johnson has basically said that I don't know what makes him tick. He's oftentimes, it's almost like he's gone so far to the right that he sometimes works with Democrats, for example, on trying to decrease some of the funding toward the United States sends to Israel. He worked with some of the most liberal members of the House of Representatives, as well as Marjorie Taylor Greene. He's obviously one of only two members of the House of Representatives who voted against the Big Beautiful Bill Act. So he's very much, I think, a danger to many Republicans. So that's what's really going on there. In terms of historically, is there anything that's really happened like the Epstein files? I don't think so. I don't think there's anything that's really happened very similar to this. I think that from a conspiracy theorist standpoint, many believe that kind of there's a lot of corruption and that there's a lot of certainly corruption involving elected officials. So we'll see what happens here. But from a public relations standpoint, obviously this is something that that has really turned some of the base against Donald Trump, some of the MAGA base who were really who were very laudatory toward Donald Trump when he announced that he would release the files. So I think this is really a public relations headache or imbroglio for Donald Trump.
Rich Rubino, political analyst and historian. Always a pleasure to have you here at Live Now from Fox. Thank you so much again. We'll talk soon.
Thank you so much. My pleasure.
Of course.